Wisconsin's worst nightmare. Back on the floor. How's the weather, Wisconsin? Hell's frozen over, right? Look, guys, this is how we're doing this tonight. Porn, torture, rape, bondage. The motive for Stephen Avery. Okay? And it's written in a November 15th article. But it's a little catch. We're not going to disclose the information about an accomplice yet, is what Sheriff Pagel says. So, tonight is one of those nights we kind of put into perspective Brendan Dassey being premeditated beforehand in the political realm. If you've been following me the last couple of nights, I've been breaking stuff down. I urge you to watch those videos to catch up. Now, here's where we're at in Stephen's case. Kathleen Zellner has dropped the ball. She's dropped the ball alleging Bobby Dassey and Scott Tadage. And she even goes as far as in April of 2021 to say that Barb, Brendan's mother, unwittingly helped with a cover-up. Now, I'm going to be the person who defends Barb Tadage, and I'm going to be a person who defends Bobby Dassey, okay? And the reason for this is that Kathleen Zellner doesn't know anything about the Nelson technique, nor the Avery law that went into effect, and she doesn't really understand why Fassbender sat on the CD of the Dassey home computer for 13 years. So that's what tonight's video is going to cover. I'm going to pull a Norman Gunn, and we're going to deviate from protocol to make sense. Okay? That's where all of Brendan and Stephen's supporters need to be right now. Is to grasp the concept of Brendan Dassey being built as a main suspect in November, not February. It's not when Kayla Avery says so and so about the counselor, then they start to question Brendan. No, Brendan. See, there's two things you gotta realize. Number one, November 6th, when Brendan is talking to Anthony O'Neill, Marinette County Sheriff's Office, Brendan says, "Do you think he done it?" And then Anthony O'Neill goes, "Brendan, you asked the question. You said, do you think he done it? Done what?" And Brendan goes, "Do you think that he raped her?" This is Stephen raping Teresa Hallback. This is one day after the RAV4 has been found. That was brought to DCI agent Kim Skorlinski's attention immediately. Okay? And then number two, Brendan Dassey on November 6th is the very first person to say he watched Teresa go into Uncle Stephen's trailer. Now, Bobby gets on the stand in Stephen Avery's trial, February 2007. Okay? Brendan is saying this November 6th. And Bobby is called as a state's witness by Ken Kratz. And Bobby says he saw Teresa walk towards Stephen's trailer. Bobby never says he saw Teresa enter the trailer. He never says that. They get this information from Brendan on November 6th. And everything that Anthony O'Neill is talking to about a Brendan, it's relayed to the DCI and the Calumet County District Attorney, okay, Ken Kratz. So how does Ken Kratz put Bobby on the stand to specifically, and he specifically tries to establish a timeline of seeing Teresa go towards Stephen's house, but yet Brendan, November 6th, says he watched Uncle Stephen go inside. So there's a different walking towards, and then Brendan saying she goes inside. He saw Teresa go inside. So November 10th rolls around, and it's 4 days later, and Skordlinski, he sits there and tells Brendan, ask him questions about the garage, ask him questions about the gray Suzuki, tells him, you know what I think, Brendan? Right here is where Teresa died. Okay, Teresa died right here in this. She was burned. Brendan, did you see any body parts? Did you help your Uncle Stephen? Now's not the time to be lying to protect Uncle Stephen. Okay? So rape comes up November 6th. And all this, Brendan, did you use a shovel at any time? Brendan tells Skordlinski on November 10th that he was using a shovel in the fire. So now you got Brendan Dassey possibly scattering around body parts in the very pit where they already believe that Teresa was burned. First thing he tells Skordlinski is that, he drove around, he picked up the tires, and he picked up the seat, but when he got to the fire, there was already 2 black trash bags in the fire, okay, that Stephen had put in. So it's on the radar that when the fire starts on Halloween Day, that it's on Skordlinski's radar with the DCI that Brendan is there for the beginning of it. There's no way, like Skordlinski tells Brendan on November 10th, that you didn't see body parts in this fire. Brendan mentions the rape. Brendan mentions Teresa walking in to Stephen's trailer. So 5 days later, on November 15th, they're charging Stephen with first-degree intentional homicide. And Wiegert is talking about a motive. And this is printed in an article on November 15th. Let me pull that article up for you real quick. I'm going to read it. Give me just a second because I want to read this word for word. Okay, so it's November 15th. Investigators are looking for evidence of pornography, torture, and death on the computer hard drive belonging to Stephen Avery, the man they suspect killed a Calumet County woman. Search warrants returned Monday in the case of Teresa Hallback, who disappeared October 31st and whose partially burned remains are believed to be those found at the Avery property, said Avery's computer has been turned over to officers from the Grand Chute Police Department. The department, like the state crime lab, conducts forensic examinations of computers which can restore files and images that have been erased. The search warrant return filed by Calumet County Sheriff's Sergeant Mark Wiegert said he thinks that images of pornography, torture, and death may be relevant as to issues of intent, motive, or Stephen Avery's plan to commit violent or sexual torture against Teresa Hallback. So here's the 15th. Wiegert is saying we're checking this hard drive because the motive, he thinks that Avery had a plan to commit violent or sexual torture against Teresa Hallback. And so the only thing that would give him sexual torture in this motive at the moment would be Brendan stating on the 6th, November 6th, to Anthony O'Neill in Crivets that, do you think he done it? Brendan, you said you think he done it. Done what? And Brendan goes, that he raped her. Stephen raping Teresa. That hasn't even come up by anybody. There's nothing about rape on November 5th. Nothing about rape anywhere until Brendan Dassey says, do you think he raped her? And Brendan Dassey says, I watched Teresa go into Uncle Stephen's trailer. And then November 10th, Skorlinski was told by Brendan that before the fire had started, Stephen already had 2 big black garbage bags in the fire. Okay? And then as the fire burned, Brendan took the shovel and went through the debris with it. Skorlinski says, now's not the time to be lying for Uncle Stephen. O'Neill's saying, come on, Brendan, were you a part of this? Blah, 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 blah. Rape, torture, pornography, they're looking for that on Stephen's hard drive, okay? As early as November 15th. On November 15th, there's also an article where they're interviewing Sheriff Jerry Pagel, Calumet County. Pagel says, we're not going to disclose any accomplices at this time, but it's going in that direction. So there's an accomplice as early as November 15th. The motive is sexual violent torture because of what Brendan said about watching Teresa go into the trailer and asking, do you think he raped her? That's been on no one's radar. But until the 6th, so November 15th, that's what's happening. Stephen Avery has an accomplice as early as November 15th. So, porn, torture, and death images are expected to be found on the hard drive. What happens in February 27th, 28th, and March 1st when they coerce Brendan Dassey. They do this 3 days of Nelson technique, not to read. March 2nd, Ken Kratz is giving a press conference over how Brendan Dassey watches Teresa go into the trailer. Then he goes in himself, okay, and all this pornography, rape, and torture and sexual violence occurs. They were gonna drop this hard drive in November. They were gonna drop the Brendan Dassey Accomplice in November. They already had it planned. So why does it take from November to February? If you're Skorlinski and you got this information for Brendan and you're with the DCI, he's the first one to mention rape. He's the first one to mention that Brendan is watching Teresa go into Stephen's trailer. And then the 15th of November, you got this motive of sexual violence, torture, and rape. And then you cut it off for 4 months and come back to it February and go straight back to that November motive and the accomplice that Jerry Pagel's talking about. Why is there a gap? I'm going to tell you why that gap's there. The gap is because the Avery bill is now requiring law enforcement to have special training classes prior to interviewing juveniles. Okay? You had to have this training done. So you pretty much, if you're Mark Wiegert and you're the DCI, you built a sexual deviant torture motive around Stephen and an accomplice, and that accomplice was the main suspect, Brendan Dassey, in November, and you built this in November. But then a bill comes along and says, oh, wait, we're going to kind of have to abandon this at the moment. We've got to take a couple of steps back because now we can't interview Brendan Dassey until law enforcement goes to this special training on how to interview juveniles. And that's why you have a November to February gap. Okay? So the hard drive that Wiegert is expecting to find all his information on, all of a sudden, it's March 1st, Brendan's telling the same story that reflects that. So if they had, now follow me closely on this. They get Brendan as an accomplice, and Wiegert's building a motive to check out the hard drive on Stephen on November 15th. They arrest Brendan March 1st, and that very exact story, scenario of porn, torture, and death reflects November 15th. So ask yourself, how come you wait till April 21st, a month and 20 days later, to pull the Dassey hard drive, right? And then when you get all that stuff back, Fassbender sits on the porn, torture, and death images for 13 years. He's sitting on those images because that was a premeditated hard drive built by the state to be used in November. They can't use it in February now because they already released an accomplice story with porn, torture, and everything else. So you can't put the hard drive back into perspective, or else it shows that everything was premeditated. You see, they got to take this premeditated hard drive, give it to Fassbender, and Fassbender hides it. That's the only thing you can do with it at this point. This hard drive was premeditated in November. Did not come off the Dassey home computer. But there's no way that you're going to suspect rape, torture, bondage, and death images in November with an accomplice. Brendan is that accomplice come March 1st, gives the same story of rape, pornography, torture, death. Okay? And they not pull the Dassey hard drive then. You see, they got to let time go by. They got to say, shit, we kind of messed up. And how they're all getting caught right now is the bill. The bill did not, the Avery bill, when it gets passed, it doesn't allow them to keep interviewing Brendan Dassey. If you're law enforcement, anytime past November 10th, you cannot interview a juvenile anymore until you've had adequate training and custodial interviews. And so Peg Lautenschlager, December 10th, she starts talking about the training seminars. She gets Neil Nelson to come and speak. And this is why I say it's running, what's on Avery Road is running directly political in the political realm to this murder. Okay, they're framing Stephen with everything on that Avery Commission. And now they're using Brendan Dassey. They were going to coerce Brendan Dassey in November. By the act of legislation, through an act of God, Brendan Dassey got a 4-month grace period. Okay? So here we are, Attorney General Lautenschlager. She takes her model policy for custodial interrogations and she makes state training courses that Ken Hammond, the director of training bureaus for the Wisconsin Department of Justice, is spearheading. Okay? And this goes on through December through February. Neil Nelson was the model policy experiment and technique to use, because Neil Nelson went to these training seminars. He taught at these training seminars. And his approach was to video stuff. And Neil Nelson taught, hey, look, everything that goes on this video is going to be memorialized for the rest of your life if you're a cop. So you want the audience, who is the judge and the jury, to see you as being good cops. So Neil Nelson is out teaching. Neil Nelson tells me in a phone conversation, an interview with him, that he remembers Fassbender and Wiegert coming up to him at these seminars before Brendan Dassey was ever interrogated. Okay? But what's interesting at these seminars is a bipartisan effort. Okay, you got a bipartisan commission where the great ball of wax that the Department of Justice is, everybody gets a chance to speak at the seminars. Jerry Buden, Stephen Drizin, Joseph Buckley would read, Neil Nelson. They're all putting little pieces of input in for law enforcement at these seminars. Wiegert and Fassbender were factually trained alongside of Hammond, Drizin, Jerry Butin, and Neil Nelson. And when Fassbender and Wiegert's training ends at the end of February, they go back to Brendan because that training has sufficed, and now they can do custodial interrogations. And that's when now they're able to drop Brendan Dassey in the Stephen Avery story as an accomplice for porn, torture, rape, sexual violence, bondage, death, murder. But they can no longer use that hard drive idea because that was prematurely launched in November 15th. So Fassbender has no choice but to sit on it. Okay? So, February 23rd. Let me see if I can pull this up. February 23rd. There's a meeting with the Criminal Justice Study Commission. And during that meeting, you have Hammond give out guidelines to the Attorney General's policy, Peg Lotschlager's model policy on custodial interrogations. This is 4 days before they start interrogating Brendan Dassey. And Hammond's going around to the table and he's handing Jerry Butin a copy. Jerry Butin's there. He's handing Stephen Drizin a copy. Stephen Drizin's there. Filming in the back of the room at the Criminal Justice Study Commission is Laura Riccardi and Maura DeMore. And they ask for a copy. So Ken Hammond gives them a copy of the Attorney General's model policy. So he gives a handout and he does a presentation. And Ken Hammond, during this presentation, talks about Neil Nelson and said cops shouldn't have anything to fear because Neil Nelson teaches you how to soften your appearance on camera. You see, Peg Lotschlager didn't want the read technique because it's learned from Drizin, Stephen Drizin and Keith Findley in a brief on the Jarrell's case that the good cop, bad cop doesn't go over well. The read technique is a little shady. It's a little harsh. It makes cops seem a little out of the way towards a suspect. So Attorney General Peg Lotschlager's ideal person to help teach the seminars was Neil Nelson's approach, because Neil Nelson, you soften your police presence, okay? And that's what we get whenever Wiegert and Fassbender start interviewing Brendan Dassey. There's no good cop, bad cop anymore. There's softening of their police presence. And Neil Nelson taught you to have respect, to respect the suspect's anxiety. Okay? You give the suspect time to talk. You let them speak things out. You don't go in there, good cop, bad cop, and run a tape for 14 hours. That's the way read technique works. Nelson's technique, you did an interview, you stayed calm, you stayed on board with the suspect and remained with a softened police presence. And we see that in Brendan Dassey's interview. Okay? You cut the camera off a couple hours. You come back the next day, you ask some questions. You cut it off, you come back the next day until you get what you want. That's the way Neil Nelson technique worked, and that's what we saw. And what we saw Uyghur and Fassbender extract from Brendan was, Brendan, tell us what you think we already know. Tell us what you think we already know, Brendan. Well, what Brendan thought that cops already know was what Skorlinski suggested to Brendan November 10th. Okay? And this interview is suppressed. But Brendan is on the DCI's radar at this point. Okay? Now is not the time to be lying to protect Uncle Stephen, Brendan. They couldn't interview Brendan anymore after that interview because the Avery bill required specific training courses on custodial interrogations. They had to abort their entire rape and torture, bondage, sexual violence, accomplice scenario. They had it November 15th they had it. They can't get back to it until March 1st after training. Then it goes back to being exactly what Uyghur said that he would find. Torture, pornography, bondage, rape, death. That's everything that Brendan Dassey talks about March 1st. Okay? That's the reason Tom Fassbender sits on that CD for 13 years. Because none of that was found on the Dassey home computer. That was being generated to be planted. See, we get Ken Kratz's press conference, right? On March 2nd. And Ken Kratz is having his press conference. And he's telling about 16-year-old Brendan Dassey takes the knife and he slits her throat, but she doesn't die. She's tied up. She's shackled to the bed. This is bondage, torture. He sexually assaults her. This is everything Mark Uyghur is talking about November 15th. So on March 1st, if Brendan's story lines up with Uyghur's motive on November 15th, 4 months earlier, why don't you pull the hard drive from the Dassey residence then? Do you get what I'm saying? They can't pull it anymore. They cannot share this information, this great big fuck up, with the news anymore. Or can they put it in court anymore that they found it on a hard drive? Because they already suggested it November 15th. So you can't suggest a Dassey hard drive on March 1st anymore, because it shows premeditation from 4 months earlier. Jerry Pagel's exact words was about the accomplice. They're not divulging any details about it, but it'll come shortly. They had their accomplice. Who's the first person on November 6th to mention rape? Do you think he done it? Hey, Brendan, you just mentioned, do you think he done it? Done what? Brendan Dassey says that he raped her, that Stephen raped Teresa. Again, you got to look at Ken Kratz. He puts Bobby Dassey on the stand. Bobby testifies that he saw Teresa walk towards Stephen's trailer. He does not say, Bobby does not say that Teresa went into the trailer. The person who says Teresa went into the trailer was Brendan Dassey. And that's on November 6th, and Cribbet's talking to Anthony O'Neill. Okay? So right there, 4 days later, Skorlinski shows up. They're doing a warrant for DNA and fingerprints on Alan Avery, and they just start questioning Brendan. Brendan's the main suspect this time because he mentioned rape, and he mentioned watching Teresa go into the trailer. And it's even in Ken Kratz's press conference that what Brendan told Anthony O'Neill, he says he watched Teresa go into Stephen's trailer. It's in the press conference on March 2nd in Ken Kratz's same information. Okay? So you can't have a rape scenario November 15th and then magically get the same rape scenario on March 1st, but not pull the Dassey hard drive until April 21st, a month and 20 days later. See, that hard drive was supposed to be dropped. They were supposed to interrogate Brendan Dassey in November, but the legislative bill, the political realm, stopped that. Y'all just don't know how the fuck political this case is. Excuse my language, but it's political. It's so political. And then, okay, well, where did Fassbender come from? Well, Attorney General Peg Lautenschlager is at a Kiwanis Club meeting, and it's in November, okay? And she briefly mentions something about the Avery case, and she says, we have our Division of Criminal Investigation special agent working with Calumet County Sheriff's Office, and she's referencing Tom Fassbender, who, I say this time and time again, his office was right across the hall from her office. So if you don't think Peg Lautenschlager is controlling this or having anything to do with it, you need to reevaluate your assessment, because she admits that she sent them in. She admits it in her own words. It's in a newspaper article. Okay? And then Fassbender sits on the CD for 13 years. Pornography, torture, rape, bondage, sexual violence, death. Everything that they were supposed to find on Stephen Avery's computer, they couldn't use it in November because they could no longer interrogate Brendan Dassey until Wiegert and Fassbender had adequate training. That's a true story. That's true facts. That's in the Avery bill itself. Article Bill 648, Wisconsin Act 60. Look it up. I'll put a link to it. Law enforcement must have specific training in custodial interrogations prior to interviewing juveniles. That's the law, folks. That's a Wisconsin state law. That's what protected Brendan Dassey after Skorlinski's interview from being made an accomplice as early as November. That's what protected him. See, they didn't ever Wiegert and Fassbender never ended their training until February. That's a fact. Brendan's untouchable from November 10th to February 27th. Brendan Dassey was untouchable by Wisconsin state legislation. They had to abandon for 4 months their own sexual, violent, porn, torture, rape story. They can't pick it back up to February. When they coerce them, they're using everything that Kim Skorlinski suggested to Brendan. But then Fassbender and Wiegert turn around and say it's the first time Brendan suggested it to the prosecution. And then we don't get Skorlinski on the stand. We get Anthony O'Neill on the stand. Why don't you call Kim Skorlinski on the stand? Because then you realize the accomplice and the motive was rape, bondage, torture, everything that they were going with when Brendan mentioned rape on November 6th. Do you think he done it? Done what, Brendan? You think that he raped her? It's the first time that rape is ever mentioned from November 3rd to November 6th. It says, do you think he raped her? And it comes from Brendan Dassey. Folks, y'all don't know how big this revelation is. Y'all don't know how criminal this revelation is. Is it political? It's very political. When you have to stop your investigation because a legislative bill makes you stop it, and then when Fassbender and Wiegert have to go train on custodial interrogations because of that legislative bill that went enacted, it's political. This is one of the largest political scandals in American history. Wisconsin. It's being pulled off by one of the most corrupt attorney generals in the state of Wisconsin, Peg Lautenschlager. She has nothing to lose. She could be dying of cancer. Okay? So, you want to know how pissed off Peg Lautenschlager was? So Senator David Zellner, one of Jerry Buden's really good friends, one of Mark Gundrum's really good friends. He was the senator that was the A or nay on the Avery Task Force's legislative enactment. In the month of November, when all this is going on, they're getting ready to pass this bill. And the Attorney General's office is attached to it as part of the Criminal Justice Study Commission. The Wisconsin Attorney General's office is attached to it. Senator David Zellner is attached to it. And it's getting ready to be signed by a governor. But it comes to a slight halt. Peg Lautenschlager didn't want it passed because it reflected Gregory Allen's was known to be the perpetrator. That's what it reflected. So Lautenschlager, she's in this process of suing people since 2003. She's gone on all these abuse of power and suing everybody. She even sues David Zellner over National Rifle Association legislative bill in November, same month, because he showed a draft to, part of some lobbyists, and she didn't get a report on it. So that was her excuse to stop the Avery bill briefly, because any other doings dealings that she had with David Zine, there was a brief recess on the Avery bill because both their names were attached to it. And they had to see if it was going to be a conflict of interest. But she filed the civil suit, so there would be a conflict of interest. It got resolved. The governor's office and the legislation went ahead and voted, and they had a special meeting for this. Does Peg Lautenschlager's civil suit on David Zine reflect any part of the Avery bill? And the reason she was filing is because she didn't want the Avery bill passed, okay? But they can't say this in legislation. So they're like, oh no, let's just rug sweep it and go on. So they went on, and Doyle eventually signed it, okay? December 16th. But make no doubt, everything to do with Stephen Avery's case is political. So how do we have Stephen Drizin, Jerry Buden, Keith Findley, all these political attorneys that know the ins and outs of all these political issues? How do we still have the greatest fucked up case in Wisconsin, but Keith Findley, Stephen Drizin, Jerry Buden not blow a whistle on the training of Wiegert Fassbender and Neil Nelson? They don't blow a whistle at the Attorney General's office. And how does Dean Strang and Jerry Buden not blow a whistle on the November 15th porn torture rape? No one went to Kathleen Zellner and said, hey, look, Kathleen Zellner, read this November 15th article. What happened to Brendan Dassey on March 1st, 4 months earlier, lo and behold, it's supposed to be found on a hard drive. Brendan Dassey was accomplice. See, they're premeditating this. DCI has been instructed by Lautenschlager's office to frame Stephen Avery. Use a special education needs child, his own nephew, to do it. They're giving instructions that's okay. If you didn't have instructions that was okay, Fassbender wouldn't have took that CD in 13 years. That would have never happened. If Fassbender was a stand-up guy, Attorney General Lautenschlager was a stand-up Attorney General, this wouldn't be happening. If Jerry Buden and Stephen Drizin were stand-up attorneys who weren't attached to deep state affiliation, political Madison, they'd be blowing a whistle. Makes you wonder why Stephen Drizin doesn't go for Brendan Dassey when Ken Kratz releases his March 2nd press conference. See, the custodial interrogations, Jerry Buden had Drizin and Madison going around helping to teach law enforcement. Here we are. Stephen Drizin knows who Stephen Avery is. Stephen Drizin knew about the Stephen Avery case. Brendan Dassey, the first kid in Wisconsin, interrogated. It goes so wrong, and Drizin was so part of that big movement. Why do you wait for 2 years? Why do you wait for 2 years to get the post-conviction to help Brendan Dassey? Why didn't you take Brendan Dassey's case pro bono immediately March 2nd, Stephen Drizin? And then whenever he gets convicted, why do you give the Dassey file to Laura Nirider, who is the baby end of the spectrum in your facility? You should have gave that file to 3 of the best attorneys in Northwestern Project. But you give it to Laura Nirider, and you tell her to look up everything about Nelson technique. which Wiegert and Fassbender just trained on. And that's how they approached Brendan Dassey, with the softening of their police presence. There was no read technique. And you might have had some of a hybrid of some things in the read introduced, but the good cop, bad cop, they know they're being memorialized. We can't do that anymore. We gotta play police softening presence all the way through. We'll get Brendan Dassey to say what we want him to, and we'll look good on camera, just like Neil Nelson teaches. Why didn't you talk to Laura Nirider about that, Stephen Drizin? You told her to look up everything in read technique. You didn't mention anything about Neil Nelson, but Brendan Dassey started being investigated on February 27th, 2006. So let's go back to that February 23rd, 2006 meeting 4 days earlier. Stephen Drizin, Laura Riccardi, and Maura DeMoore are filming it on film. They're filming it, okay? They're at this meeting filming it, and there's video of Ken Hammond talking about Neil Nelson and how Neil Nelson has been training law enforcement, okay? And he's handing out the handouts. He hands one to Jerry Buden. Jerry Buden gets a copy. Stephen Drizin gets a copy. Laura Riccardi gets a copy herself. But Drizin doesn't tell any of that to Laura Nirider. And then Jerry Buden blows me off as being a nut job. Jerry Buden blows me off as being a nut job and making a murderer. But yet, whenever true supporters of making a murderer text Jerry Buden and ask Jerry Buden, what about the Nelson technique? Tell us how Nelson's technique went. He goes, you mean read? Jerry Buden quit playing. Stephen Drizin quit playing. You got handouts from Keith Hammond. It's documented in the minutes of the Criminal Justice Study Commission. It's on video from Laura Riccardi. They were there at the meeting. So Drizin, if custodial interviews was your baby, false confessions from juveniles was your baby, how come you didn't take Stephen or Brendan Dassey's case pro bono? You didn't do it, did you? You didn't do it because you're a deep state affiliate. You, Buden, Keith Findley, y'all will all be murdered if you blow a whistle and just tell the truth. I mean, tell the truth, bury the hatchet with the state, beg for immunity. Y'all are pigs. Y'all got paid. Jerry Buden, you and Strain got paid. Y'all took Stephen Avery's settlement money, which wasn't a settlement, it was a dismissal, and y'all got paid for stuff. You didn't meet no peril from, like Attorney General Fallon says, do so at your own peril. You didn't meet any of that, did you? No, sure didn't. If you're going to get it right this time, get it right. Get it right, guys. If you want Brendan and Stephen free, it's time to expose Stephen Drizin, Jerry Buden, and Keith Findley and other political attorneys and how they worked with Attorney General's office. to screw over a 16-year-old kid, to screw over Stephen Avery on a $36 million civil suit so it wouldn't unravel human trafficking. One of these days, y'all motherfuckers are going to have to kill me. Because one of these days, Kathleen Zellner is going to see it, or some attorney is going to see it, what you did. And then Josh Call, who's Peg Lautenschlager's son, Josh Call, you're going to have a rude awakening to vouch for your mother's criminal activity and your Department of Justice criminal activity. Stephen Avery might be dead and gone at that point. Don't know how Stephen Avery's health is. He might be very well dead and gone when this happens. But Brendan Dassey, mark my words, he'll be out of prison before 2048. Before 2048, Brendan Dassey's going to walk. Because you as supporters, we're going to corner Stephen Drizin, and we're going to get to the bottom of the Neil Nelson. We're gonna put up an Elmo screen, okay? We're gonna pull down a projector, and we're gonna get that handout from Keith Hammond. Laura Nirider has a copy. Stephen has a copy. Stephen Drizin, Jerry Buden. There's a copy on file somewhere. It's got to be recorded for the minutes. And we're going to read that section, and then we're going to listen to the videotape. We're going to listen to the videotape of Laura Nirider videoing that meeting. And we're going to listen to Hammond talk at that February 23rd, 2006 meeting, 4 days before Brendan Dassey is coerced. We're going to talk about it. We're going to watch Keith Hammond talk about Neil Nelson. And then we're going to compare everything that Ken Hammond says about the Neil Nelson and Attorney General Lautenschlager's model policy to the way that Fassbender and Wiegert conducted an interview. And you're going to see it's Neil Nelson. And then you're going to ask Stephen Drizin and Jerry Buden and Keith Findley why they never blown a damn whistle in the Attorney General's office. Because porn, rape, sexual violence, torture, that was all November 15th. Brendan Dassey was an accomplice right then and there. The bill, and all you got to do is say, hey, Mark Wiegert, Tom Fassbender, weren't you required in November to have special training before interviewing custodial interviews, before interviewing juveniles? And the answer is going to be yes, because that's what the bill states, and that's what the Attorney General set up seminars for statewide. That happened, fact. That's a factual happening. It happened, Jack. It happened. And so then Laura Nirider is going to be looking dumb. She's going to be looking like a doe in the headlights, like, I've been banging Stephen Drizin, and he's been dicking Brendan Dassey for all these years. Laura Nirider, at this point, you're just as much a criminal as he is. If you're not asking the what the fuck questions that every supporter is already asking after seeing this video, then you're not helping Brendan Dassey. But again, with what I just said in this video, Bobby Dassey's innocent. Barb Tadge is innocent from any dealing with having to frame Stephen Avery. It still reverts back to police officers. And like I said last night, the motive to frame Stephen Avery is greater, was greater, and will always be greater than the motive to kill Teresa Hall. And that's going to wrap it up for tonight. Thank you for tuning in with me. We're going to do some questions on Friday, Saturday, Sunday. I guess all y'all people have fun on Friday, but maybe we'll leave that for a Sunday night, Saturday night. Stay vigilant. Let's get these men home. Because there's something about those bones. Something about those bones in that fire pit. Something that don't set right. So get Bobby and Scott out of your mind. Because there may not be a death at all.